Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Hershkovitz, and I'm the new president of the New Israel Fund of Canada. Welcome to this very special 10th annual Shira Herzog Symposium. This event has been the largest gathering of its kind since its inception in 2010, a place where Canadians can hear from experts about the current issues facing Israel and meet the people who are defending and advancing democracy, human rights, and equality in Israel on the ground every day, pandemic or no pandemic. And speaking of pandemic, this year we're meeting not in person, but virtually. While we miss seeing each other, we also have the advantage of reaching our friends outside of Toronto and people who might otherwise not be able to attend. We welcome you all. Over the next hour and a half, I'll introduce myself and my involvement in NIFC. We'll reflect on the turbulent state of Israel's democracy over the past year, and then we'll hear from our three extraordinary Israeli activists. Our speakers will also answer your questions, and then we'll let you go by 3:30 p.m. Eastern, 12:30 Pacific, and 10:30 p.m. for our Israeli guests. So, who am I and why do I care so much? Social justice has always been part of my life. My father was a union organizer and my parents were political activists. My childhood memories are of my parents attending rallies, my dad walking the picket line and marching in the Labor Day parade. I rode on the kids' bus with the reward of free entry to the X, the Canadian National Exhibition, at the end of the day. I grew up in an immigrant family in downtown Toronto that was proudly Jewish, progressive, and activist. I grew up believing that Jewish values and progressive values are one and the same, and that when you see injustice, you try to do something about it. These values led me to my profession in the field of international development, specifically in the area of gender equality, social inclusion, and the empowerment of women. My work gives me the privilege of working with and learning from inspiring change makers around the world. I've seen firsthand the vital importance of a thriving civil society, grassroots organizations representing ordinary people working on the ground to safeguard the rights we take for granted in more open societies. My parents' commitment to social justice was not divorced from their love of Israel. Their Zionism was rooted in the principles of inclusion, equality, and human rights, expressed in Israel's Declaration of Independence. For me, there's something very personal at stake when this country that calls itself Jewish, the Jewish state, starts losing its democratic and egalitarian character. I don't expect it to be better than other countries, but I do expect it to live up to its founding principles for everyone it governs. For that reason, I've been a supporter of the New Israel Fund for over 15 years. I joined the board about 5 years ago and now have been given the incredible privilege and responsibility of being its president. 3 years ago, my husband and I joined in an NIFC study tour in Israel so we could meet personally many of the activists we support. You'd think that because I'm involved in similar work elsewhere in the world, that seeing these kinds of projects in Israel would feel ordinary, not so impressive, but that's far from the case. The way NIF works makes total sense to me. My work has taken me to many countries whose commitment to human rights and the rule of law is fragile at best. And I've been incredibly inspired by the achievements and struggles of activists and grassroots civil society organizations working in such challenging environments. But as we well know, Israel is a more open society, and it's also complex and faces challenges that are unique. By the end of my trip, I was so uplifted by the activists we'd met from all walks of life, young and old, Jewish and Arab, secular and religious, gay and straight, women and men, citizens, refugees, and asylum seekers, change makers from so many different cultural backgrounds. I was inspired not only by what these activists stand for, but how they go about making change and how NIF supports them in doing it. Today, you will meet 3 leaders from some of these same organizations, leaders whose work is supported directly by you, our Canadian NIF family. But first, to set the stage for our panelists, let's look back briefly over this anything but ordinary year. If you recall, we began 2020 amidst Israel's 3rd elections. The 2 previous rounds of voting had deadlocked. Netanyahu was still in power, and our partners in Israel had already spent a year fighting vicious incitement and outrageous attempts at voter suppression. But 2020, in many ways, would surprise us even more. In January, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood next to US President Donald Trump at the White House and unveiled a new so-called peace plan. Of grave concern to us was the plan's green light for unilateral annexation of parts of the West Bank. Doing so, even in part, would grossly violate international human rights norms and potentially inflame violence. It could very well end any hope for a 2-state solution. By March, the election results were in, still with no break in the deadlock. Would Israel's next government continue initiatives to undermine the Supreme Court, deepen orthodoxy's rule over secular life, and shield Netanyahu from indictment? We bit our nails nervously during weeks of coalition haggling. But as COVID-19 erupted in Europe and landed within Israel, pressure on Israeli politicians to avoid a 4th election finally peaked. What happened next stunned even seasoned observers of Israel's politics. Benny Gantz of the New Blue and White Party reneged on his campaign promise and joined Netanyahu's Likud party in a unity deal. This, by the way, also slammed the door on the tantalizing possibility of a center and left coalition between Jewish and Arab political parties. By late April, the coalition agreement was signed. The new government was both good and bad, good in that it froze many of the previous administration's illiberal initiatives. But this agreement also contained a stipulation to quickly and unilaterally annex parts of the West Bank. That was when Israeli civil society and NIF and its allies all over the world knew we had to act. This was an existential issue for human rights, democracy, and any hope for a just outcome for Palestinians. In Israel, NIF brought together disparate sectors, peace groups, human rights NGOs, security experts. Only together could a concerted public campaign raise the issue amidst a worsening pandemic. Outside Israel, at the same time, NIF branches and liberal Jewish groups all over the world acted together to raise a loud voice opposing annexation. Here in Canada, NIFC immediately made our opposition known to Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we worked with JSpace Canada and Canadian Friends of Peace Now to publish a public letter to Prime Minister Trudeau, signed by 40 prominent Canadian Jews. Our voices, along with those of former Canadian diplomats and many others, made a difference. And indeed, July 1st arrived, but annexation did not. As the days and then weeks went by, we grew more and more certain that the clear and united opposition from the governments of Israel's closest allies, bolstered by leadership within their Jewish communities, had succeeded. Annexation's window of opportunity had closed, at least for now. One big reason that annexation lost its momentum is, of course, a tragic one. Instead of dealing effectively with the pandemic, the fragile unity government was being pulled apart by Likud's attempts to shield Netanyahu from prosecution. By July, coronavirus cases were climbing every day, and government aid was not reaching those who needed it. NIFC's partners saw that the pandemic was especially hurting the most vulnerable: women, the precariously employed, asylum seekers, people with disabilities, Palestinian citizens, residents of Gaza and the West Bank, and ramped up their work even more. Over the summer, public opinion toward the government began to sour. Since early July, weekly protests outside the Prime Minister's residence have clashed against heavy-handed police. But they've grown from a few hundred to tens of thousands each weekend. And even the recent positive news of a new accord between Israel and the United Emirates, and now Bahrain, won't change much for the most vulnerable Israelis, nor does it bring much hope to the Palestinians. What a turbulent year, and it's not over yet. And while some of Israel's leaders may have been hoping that this turbulence would let them get away with their own agenda, we were paying attention. Israel's civil society is strong and experienced, and NIFC and our partners know that democracy and equality are most at risk during times of crisis. That's what NIFC was built for, to support them in any way possible. So, will the unity government survive, or will there be a fourth election? What is being done to protect and promote the rights of vulnerable populations in the face of the deepening public health and economic crisis? How will the fabric of Israeli society and its democracy be repaired? What are our partners doing to respond to these multiple challenges? To answer these questions and more, our Executive Director, Ben Moraine, will introduce our three panelists. Ben?
Thanks, Linda. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Ben Moraine, and I'm the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund of Canada. I'm excited to moderate our conversation with these three Israeli leaders of projects funded by many of you, Canadians who support the work of the New Israel Fund of Canada. We've picked these three because they represent a stimulating mix of issues and strategies that are actually making headway and give us a glimpse of the vibrant, noisy, unrelenting defense of progressive values that lies underneath the headlines of what's happening in Israel. Throughout our conversation, feel free to ask us questions in the chat box if you're watching us on YouTube, and I'll pose them to our speakers later in the program. Feel free also to tell them how much their work means to you and what you're learning that maybe you didn't know or didn't appreciate before. Let me introduce them to you. First up, there's Orly Erez-Liachovsky, Director of the Legal Department at the Israel Religious Action Center, also known as IRAC. Orly is a lawyer, trained at Tel Aviv University and Columbia University's law schools. She served as an attorney at IRAC for 16 years and became Director of the Legal Department in 2014. In this position, she's won legal achievements such as making gender segregation on public transportation illegal, ending the Orthodox monopoly on state-funded salaries to rabbis, and winning state funding for the construction of non-Orthodox synagogues. Pretty big stuff. Our Canadian-funded project with IRAC belongs to our issue area of religious freedom because of their uncontested legal expertise in this area. And our particular project is about women's and LGBTQ rights. But IRAC also plays a major role in the wider picture of NIF work in Israel on combating racism. Next is Gil Gun-Mor. Gil is the Unit Director for Civil and Social Rights at the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, known as ACRI. Gil is also a lawyer, but with a different area of expertise. He was first trained at Tel Aviv University and then got his master's in law at American University in DC as part of NIF's Civil Liberties Law Fellowship. 5 years ago, Gil became ACRI's director for its work on social and economic rights, and a year ago, he also took on the Civil Rights Unit. On a daily basis, he deals with freedom of expression and protest, criminal justice, privacy, and more. And alongside the Civil Rights and Social Rights units, Gil also heads up the Human Rights in the Digital Age project. You know, a pretty small job. ACRI is the flagship partner of NIFC and the global NIF family. Because they deal with all the issues that we do, and because they've racked up more precedent-setting victories at Israel's Supreme Court for human rights than any other institution. Our Canadian project this year is specifically on socioeconomic rights, like, for example, the right to housing during a pandemic. Last but not least is Raluca Ganea, founding executive director of Zazim Community Action, a new and rapidly growing online mobilization platform. Raluca has 20 years of experience campaigning for social change and human rights in Israel. Before founding Zazim, Raluca was a campaigner and consultant at Avaz.org, which is the world's largest and most powerful online activist network. And in a previous role as campaigns director at the Geneva Initiative, Raluca led, get this, the first online demonstration in the world in 2004. Zazim itself is an incredible story of success and strategic philanthropy. A few years ago, Zazim didn't exist, but NIF saw the need for something like it in Israel. So NIF in Israel worked with Raluca to incubate and launch this progressive online mobilizer, just like MoveOn.org in the US or Lead Now in Canada. And 6 years later, they have over 200,000 active members. Hi, Raluca, Gil, and Orly, please unmute yourself and turn on your cameras. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Hello, hello.
Hi. Hello.
So we have a few, this is the way this is gonna work. There's a few rounds of questions. We'll take each of them in turn. And then we're gonna take a break in a little bit for a bit of an interlude, and then we'll conclude with one more question and a chance for us to answer all the questions from our viewers. So first, before we dive into the politics and the activism on the ground, first, I'd just like you each to introduce yourselves. So, would you please tell our viewers, how you got into the field of social change, where you came from, where you grew up in Israel, or where you came from, if not in Israel. So Raluca, would you do us the kindness of going first? And then Gil and Orly, and I'll help time you. I'll let you all know when it's your turn. Raluca, please.
Sure, thanks, Ben. I'm really happy to be here with everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you all. So as Ben said, I'm the founding ED of Zazim. I live in Jaffa. I have 2 kids and 2 cats, and the 2 cats might make a guest appearance on this call. I can't control that, I'm afraid. Zazim, as Ben said, was incubated by NIF 6 years ago. And NIF actually chose me to lead this project when I was 9 months pregnant with my first son. Rachel Liel, who was then NIF's director in Israel, said I gave birth to 2 children that year, the second one being Zazim. And I have to say that these are 2 life-changing events that are deeply connected. I do the work that I do for my kids, for all of our children, and it also is deeply connected to the child that I was and what I've learned from my parents. I was born in Romania during the communist regime. And when I was 3 years old, my parents decided to leave Romania, so I grew up in a democratic country. I always felt committed to do anything and everything in my power so that my parents won't feel that the big sacrifice they've made for my sake was made for nothing. I grew up in Jerusalem. I went to high school during the big suicide terror attacks in the 90s, and I was 16 and a half when Rabin was murdered. And this is probably the event that, together with my immigration experience, has shaped my worldview the most. I honestly don't think that I could have done anything else in my life except trying to do everything for the Israeli democracy.
Oh, hi, everybody. Thank you, Raluca, and I'm very happy to attend this event. Well, I grew up in a normal, typical middle-class Israeli family in a small city near Tel Aviv, Givat Shmuel. And I was on my way to do the regular course of life of young Israelis, going to school, youth movement, military service, and then a trip to South America or somewhere else. And my interest in social change and equality grew from my personal experience growing up as a gay teenager in the late 80s in Israel and the beginning of the 90s. It was a whole different era back then. And I knew, I understood how difficult it is to be a minority, to be different. And I'm a tough guy. I have family support, but still I was deep in the closet for many years, afraid to go out, ashamed even admit who I am. And I didn't have any role model back then. So in 1998, when Dana International, and if you don't know her, she's a singer, a trans woman that was chosen to represent Israel in a big singing competition, the Eurovision, was elected to represent Israel in 98. I was inspired and I started my own process. And after my military service, I went to South America. And then I remember one day I was in Cusco when I called my mother from a phone center. We didn't have any cell phones back then. And she told me that I got a really good score in my psychometric exam. So immediately I told her, okay, sign me up for law school. And I knew then that I want to become a lawyer that deals with human rights. And when I got back from my trip, I also came out of the closet. And in my school, in the law school, I went to the human rights clinic. And after that, I started in 2003 to do my internship in the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. And the rest is history.
Thanks, Gail. Orly.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here alongside Gil and Raluca. I was actually born in Canada, not in Toronto, but rather in Ottawa. My parents spent a sabbatical there. My father was on his postdoc, but as a baby, I came back to Israel. And I grew up in Rehovot. My whole life, I spent a couple of years in the States, both as a child and then later studying. And I think I was always drawn to, I think injustice always disturbed me and frustrated me. And after finishing the army, going to law school was sort of the natural way to make my way into the world. And I went to study law because I saw law as an important tool for social change. So after completing my first degree, I went to Columbia and studied for the master's degree, and I focused on human rights. And it gave me sort of deepened my my knowledge in this area. And after coming back to Israel, I found my home at Iraq, where I've been ever since, quite a while now. I live in Mevaseret now, which is a small a suburb of Jerusalem, and I'm here with my family. We're a part of the Reform congregation, and I feel deeply connected to the Reform notion of Tikkun Olam, of the fact that one of the most important mitzvot of being a Jew is trying to fix the world. Justice, justice shall you pursue. So this is really an important part of me being a Jewish person living in Israel, trying to fix injustices in Israeli society. And this is what I've been trying to do ever since I joined Iraq.
Thank you. Thanks, Orly. And you're the one, Orly, you're the one of our panelists today that I haven't actually met in person, although I've had the privilege of meeting Raluca and Gil before. So it's a really delight to have all three of you here representing the different things that you do in your different, I see that we have 3 different countries of origin, really. We have Canada, Romania, and born in Israel. I think as we get into your issues, like we'll also see that on the surface, there may be similarities, but as you pull it apart, actually, it's a great diversity of issues and strengths and focuses. So before we get into, let's start getting into that a little bit, at least. You know, your organizations have been around for, for a number of years. Iraq for a long time, Iraq for a while. Zazim is you're the newest, and what you normally do is important enough. And in a year as unusual as this, we know, I know from looking at the projects that we intended to do together at the beginning of the year. When we started talking about, what projects are going to be funded out of Canada, we thought we were going to do one thing. And then by the time March came along, of course, whatever we thought we were doing pivoted completely. And one of the most inspiring things to watch has been how you all have, taken the work that you do, the priorities you do, the strategies you use, the strengths that you have, and immediately moved everything, changed everything in order to deal with a completely new situation of which there was no playbook. There was no template or example on how to deal with a global pandemic. So sort of by way of talking about what your organization normally does and what you're doing now, would you tell us how you all had to pivot? What does your organization normally do? And how has that had to change in light of the health crisis? So Orly, if you go first, and then we'll have Raluca and Gil too.
Sure. So IRAC, what IRAC normally stands for and what we try to promote is freedom of religion, issues relating to promoting equality in Israeli society, and fighting religious extremism. So we usually do, we fight racism and racist incitement. We fight exclusion of women and gender segregation in the public sphere. And we promote LGBTQ rights. We actually continued to do all of this during the pandemic because we still had many cases going on, and other than a couple of weeks where the courts were closed during March and April, we resumed our legal work pretty soon, and we have filed new cases, both petitions and civil suits on all of those areas that I've just mentioned. But definitely this pandemic has raised new concerns and worries, and I want to tell you about two issues which we've dealt with quite recently, and they both relate to LGBTQ rights. During the pandemic and still now, non-Israelis are not allowed to enter Israel, only under very strict conditions. And it turned out that people who wanted to get married and wanted the relatives to come to attend the wedding, even though it's a very small wedding because large weddings are not allowed, were only allowed to do so only if they married through the rabbinate. So only if they were married in Orthodox marriage, which means that LGBTQ couples could not be included, and also other people who chose to marry outside of the chief rabbinate. We turned to the Ministry of Interior and to the Attorney General, and after our letter, it was clarified to all the embassies across the world that this is not necessary, and basically anybody who wants to attend either their children's weddings, then they're allowed to do so, even if it's not through the rabbinate. So then that's fine, but they had to have a place to have this wedding, and all the wedding venues are closed because of the pandemic. So different municipalities across Israel offered couples to have their weddings out in the open here in Israel. Mostly it's nice outside in the evenings, so in different locations, and it was many cities all around Israel started this initiative, which is a very nice initiative. But Jerusalem decided to open this initiative only again to couples who marry in an Orthodox marriage through the rabbinate. So again, anybody who can't or won't marry through the rabbinate was not allowed to do so. We took the Jerusalem municipality to court alongside LGBTQ organizations such as the Open House for Pride and Tolerance. And the Attorney General decided to join our case and supported our petition, stating that this is illegal discrimination, that the municipality should basically allow anybody who wants to get married to take part in this initiative. Actually, the ending was a little sour because the court ordered the municipality to reconsider its position according to the Attorney General's attitude, but the court also gave the municipality the option of deciding just to stop the initiative. And of course, this is what they decided to do. But still, I think it was a very important step that the Attorney General said to the municipality, this is not allowed. So those are just two examples of the things we've done in recent weeks on this issue.
Yeah, and there was something you can see how like the issues that we're focused on, they don't go away when there's a health crisis.
Definitely.
It's just those populations get further squeezed out. Those issues get even more elevated, and I think that's what we'll continue. That's what we'll continue to see in the stories that you're telling. There was a moment you said briefly that when the courts were shut down. Do you want to tell a little bit about that for just a sec?
So we had a couple of weeks basically where we had complete closure and we did not have any court hearings, and many court hearings were postponed. Sort of the whole country was on a standstill. And then around May, things sort of started to open up a bit. Unfortunately, we are now going into a second closure, and God knows how long this is going to take. So it seems we're going through this all over again, which is very distressing. But hopefully, in a couple of weeks, we'll get back to normal. And again, we continue to do all of our work all the time, because, you know, unfortunately, there's still racism around, and people discriminated on the basis of religion or sexual orientation or their gender, and we're still keeping this.
No, and that's to shut down the court system for a number of weeks is like, there's a huge question here about balancing the health needs in a health crisis and, you know, keeping democracy alive and working. It was, for those of you who joined us, boy, I guess it was almost, you know, just over 5 months ago when we had the director of Gil's organization, ACRI, join us. And she told us, Sharon Abraham Weiss told us how, of course, when they decided to shut down the court system, Bibi, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu's deputies shut it down conveniently the morning of his first corruption trial.
Right.
Which I think just goes as one piece of evidence that, you know, in
well,
moments
we now have a new justice minister, so it's a little bit different, because back then we had Ohana, who was from the Likud, and he was definitely doing whatever Netanyahu asked him to do.
No, you know, in times of crisis is when democracy and human rights are most at risk. So I think that's a great transition to Raluca with your work.
Sure. So actually, Zim is about civil action and about people power campaigning, including both online and offline organizing, mobilizing in big numbers. So we usually respond to crisis and opportunity on the ground, looking where we can have, where our model and strategy can have added value, and where, when, and how we can have maximum impact. So the current situation hasn't shifted our work in a serious way. We just, as usual, responded to what's happening on the ground. And since we always use digital campaigning tools, we were and still are well positioned to act and to offer our members significant action opportunities when there is a lockdown or other limitations on social gatherings. We did focus on other issues than what we thought this year would be about. And we heard it at the beginning on the annexation that didn't happen. And we thought that this year would be a lot more on stopping the annexation, and that the campaign against the annexation would give us here in Israel the opportunity to build a popular anti-occupation movement. But this opportunity didn't happen because the atmosphere and the public attention wasn't on the issue at all. We thought we would keep taking forward the concept of Jewish-Arab partnership, especially integrating Palestinian citizens and their political representatives in national decision-making. Instead, we found ourselves fighting for the basic elements of our democracy that was threatened by the disastrous way that the current government is dealing with the global COVID pandemic. We fought the attempt to give Shabak, the General Security Force, the authority to invade the privacy of citizens and monitor all of our phones all the time in order to track down COVID positive patients. We found ourselves fighting state and police violence that extended and expanded into protests within the Green Line and to new populations, not only to Palestinian citizens and Ethiopian citizens as people were used to, but also to other populations in Israel. That was something that actually gave us the opportunity to raise the awareness to the issue in wider public and to build solidarity for the campaign against it. The arbitrary and irrational decision-making of the government regarding the COVID pandemic actually raised a popular protest against Netanyahu, which we are proud to take part in as well, in protests across the country. So this is what we've been doing in the last couple of months.
just so our folks understand, when you say digital tools and digital mobilization, what it means is that people join the email list, usually by signing something, taking part in an action, and then they get rolled into more and more actions, so that these are action alerts online. Can you just describe a little bit more about, what does that mean, Online Mobilizer?
First of all, we give our members and others who are not our members yet the opportunity to take action with us. You don't join our mailing list, you don't join the Zim's manifest or anything like that. You join when you're doing an action. You're becoming part of us by doing something. And what we're doing in our campaign is trying to find the most impactful, most significant actions to offer our members. We call it actions that have a very good or very strong reader-focused theory of change. So the action can vary between signing a petition or a pledge to donating money for some kind of a project or event, to come and protest offline, to send emails, to send text messages, to come to a demonstration offline. It can vary. It can be really, there isn't a limit to what we can offer our members. It just depends on the issue itself. And as Ben, as you mentioned before, we have the same model as Lead Now in Canada and Move On in the States. And it's not a coincidence, we're part of the same network, which is called Open. That is a global sisterhood of organizations working, each one in their respective countries all over the globe, from more functioning democracies like Canada is at the moment, to less fortunate ones, like
it's all
Poland
a little,
and
it's all
Hungary.
a little relative.
Yeah, it's all very relative.
In fact, for our viewers, many of you may or may not have, you probably didn't notice that this global network of online mobilizers took out ads in Canadian papers. For Black Lives Matter, talk about a crossover. And if you looked in the Toronto Star, there with the other dozens and dozens of logos of these organizations all over the world, you would have seen Zazim's little logo down there in the Toronto Star. Talk about international sisterhood of organizations working together on things. Thanks for that explanation, Raluca. And I think we'll get a better sense of that activism when we get into the next question. So Gil, would you also, what did you think you were going to do this year? And what are you actually doing this year?
So normally ACRI works on a wide spectrum of human rights issues. We have 5 main topics: civil liberties and civil rights, political rights, social rights, human rights in the occupied territories of Palestinians, rights of the Arab minority in Israel, and rights of refugees and immigrants. And we are very famous for our legal action, which is focused on strategic litigation, big important cases that can change reality for many. But we're also very active in the Knesset, going to meetings and giving our remarks on new legislation. We have hotlines that receive thousands of calls each year. We have outreach department and education department, which works with teachers and teach them how to teach children and not to be racist and about human rights and so on. So the COVID-19 pandemic was a major event in the life of ACRI, a dramatic event. In the beginning of the year, in about January, February, we already started to see restrictions that imposed on other countries, and we had clear understanding that we're going to see draconian restrictions on civil liberties when the pandemic hits Israel. Many of them would be just and reasonable, for sure, but we also expected that some of them will be not legitimate and dangerous for human rights. We know that this kind of time, this kind of crisis is dangerous for human rights. And we were also right about that. So the first thing we did was, of course, open a WhatsApp group called Corona and Us. But then we started working really, really hard. So in the mid of March, in the middle of the night, the government, something that Raluca also mentioned, decided to authorize the Israeli security service, the secret security service, the Shin Bet, to start tracking people who got COVID-19 and everyone that was in close contact with them, using tools that were developed to fight terrorism and to not to track innocent civilians. And in 2 days, we went to the High Court of Justice with an urgent petition. And I think that as a human rights lawyer, I never imagined that I will be in the Supreme Court in such circumstances. And then we had two hearings, and then after less than 2 months, the High Court of Justice, which is in Israel, the Supreme Court, had a really terrific decision in our petition, claiming that if the government wants to continue using the Shin Bet and invade our privacy and freedom, he has to go to the parliament and have a full legislation. And so this was a big achievement. And we had another, I would say, 4 major roles in this crisis. First is to protect the basic civil liberties and rights from unproportional harm, like freedom of expression and protest, and the right to privacy, as I mentioned. Second is to keep as much as possible the democratic norms, even though it's a crisis. So stop using regulation for a time of emergency, which the government did without use it a lot, and try to protect the independence of the court. As you mentioned, that was one of the first move of the government was to freeze the action of the court. And about the way that government receive decisions which affect human rights, even though it's a time of crisis, to do it as much democratic as possible. Third was to make sure that that the poor and the unprivileged population can survive the closure and the economic crisis. So we did a lot of stuff to stop electricity disconnections and to prevent evictions from public housing, and to give back money that was taken from refugees and so on. And last, we also took care of the equality. So we had some petitions that were attempting to force the government to treat our minority equally regarding the way they services to combat the pandemic, and that children in the Bedouin communities can also learn from home like other Israelis, because they don't have the infrastructure and the electricity and the computers to do it. So this was our main points of action, and we worked really hard to do it. And I think we did a great job during this crisis. I'm very proud.
So it sounds like everything. You were working on everything.
We were working around the clock, basically. It was maybe the hardest time that I worked in all my years in the Association for Civil Rights. And it's definitely was not a normal time for the organization. not the same tempo, nothing was the same like before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Like this is part of why you're doing amazing work. Like all sort of, like all frontline workers, people, the cashier at the grocery store, the nurse and the paramedic, and like all of these people who their lives are also upside down. They're also trying to work from home or get childcare, or they're trying to take care of their parents or their relatives or their friends who need it. You guys are doing all of that and trying to mobilize, like reprioritize the organization, the work of your organization, and then keep doing the work that needs to be done, the work that is going to help so many others make it through this pandemic as much as possible. And so I just, it's just remarkable to hear these stories. The work you've been doing is just incredibly inspiring. So, one of the reasons we wanted to have you here is just so that, we could also say thank you. We fund your work, we see your work, we get all these great reports, we see the stories, the interviews that you give about the work you're doing. And it gives us hope and it inspires us, both for Israel's well-being, but also for our own work at home that we derive. We're working with many of the same issues here in our own communities, and we derive insight and inspiration from what you guys do there too. Let's talk. My next question for you is a bit about sort of behind the headlines. Those of us who read and watch the news coming out of Israel, even if we're reading, say, Haaretz or Times of Israel or 972 magazine or any number of places, there's only so much makes it into the headlines. And like, you really got to be in Israel to know everything that's going on and to see all of it. And of course, if we're only checking the headlines, every week or every month, some people, we may only see the end result of the work that you've done. And sometimes the evidence that you've done a great job is that nothing worse happened. So I want you to, if you could, take us into sort of behind the headlines. Where can you point to some big accomplishments or victories? What are you really proud of? Give all of our Canadian supporters a sense of, what did you accomplish this year? So let's go Raluca, Gil, and then Orly.
So I want to mention two accomplishments, or one victory and one accomplishment we had since the pandemic started. The victory we had was a Zim campaign targeting the health ministry and asking it to publish all relevant information on the pandemic also in Arabic. Something that I didn't do before our campaign and didn't feel obligated to in the post-Nation Bill atmosphere.
How long was that? How long was it?
The campaign?
Well, from when they didn't until they did.
It actually took us a week to change their mind. That's part of the power. I mean, one of the advantages you have when you mobilize big numbers online is that you get a quick response. We were able to gather thousands of people to join the call, both Palestinian citizens and Jewish citizens, and get also some media on our campaign, and the response was very quick. I mean, it's a small thing, and it's not something you would hear in the headlines, exactly as you said, but it has such a big meaning for so many people that could access information that wasn't available for them before that, life-saving information.
And you said it was a week from when you launched your campaign, but how many days, how many weeks had it been that the government was communicating about COVID-19 only in Hebrew, not in the language of the population of a fifth of Israel?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but 2 weeks maybe. The crucial first 2 weeks of the pandemic, where still the health ministry has published the route of every patient, so people would know if they were in contact with them, and people were following that obsessively to know if they need to go into lockdown. But yeah, and that wasn't available in Arabic.
Do you think they would have made that change without your campaign?
I'm sure they wouldn't. And that's one of the things that has changed because of the nation bill that was approved 2 years ago. And that's why our work, all of the organizations that are here, is very important. Because we can make them change their mind in either in legal ways or in public campaigning, even though that the law doesn't obligate them to do so.
You mentioned a second one.
Yes, the second one is an emergency hotline on social issues that we launched and ran in April and in May, in the first peak of the pandemic, when the economic consequences of the pandemic became more present and pressing, and unemployment rates went up to 25%. The hotline was 100% funded by small donations of the Zim members. This is again a way we operate when we give people different opportunities to act and do something. So hundreds of people donate to this campaign, and then a couple of dozens also volunteered, and they were operating the hotline in Hebrew and in Arabic, providing first-line support and aid to the most vulnerable and marginalized populations that were hurt by the pandemic. That was a super inspiring experience for our community and for the people the hundreds of people who used that.
Wow, completely member generated.
Yes.
You know, they funded it, they volunteered on it. Wow, wow, amazing. Gil, I think you're up next. Thank you, Raluca.
So I would like to talk about a case that recently ended after 4 years, which is about social and economic rights, because NAF Canada support us on this topic. So the case was about discrimination of the periphery in Israel, the north and the south, in healthcare services in comparison to those given to people in the center of the country, which is a major problem in Israel. We have a good healthcare system, I must say, but there is a very big gaps and inequality between the services that people receive in the center of the country and those in the periphery. So we are focusing on one service, which is rehabilitation services, which are critical for those who undergone illness, serious illness, or an accident, or brain damage. And rehabilitation allows the person to go back to normal life and not being dependent on others. And there are 2 stages in rehabilitation. If you want, first you go to the hospital and then spend sometimes a few months in the hospital, and then you continue on a day center near your house. So when we started the petition, there was 5 times more beds for rehabilitation in hospitals in the center than in the north and the south. And also the day centers were not in the same quality. No, in the north or the south, they didn't have enough centers, and they weren't enough doctors, and so on. And in addition, there were no rehabilitation services for children anywhere else but in the center of the country. So our petitioner was a mother of 2 children that both needed rehabilitation services. One was injured in the army, and the second one, the girl had a terrible accident in a club, and they needed a long rehabilitation services, and she lived in the south. So she had to go and actually move to the center to spend time near her daughter when she was hospitalized near Tel Aviv. And when she was out of the hospital, she didn't have anywhere to go with good quality near her house. So she needed to go 3 times a week to the center to continue the treatment, which was very harmful for her recovery.
Presumably this was, she had to get to the center of Israel, she had to have her own transportation, because I imagine public
Right.
transportation is not going to work for her, or
was
is
not-
inadvisable with the pandemic.
No, she needed a special car, and it cost a lot of money, which nobody paid, the family, and it tore the family apart. And so this mother gave us the position that we presented to the court, and was another mother from the north with a similar story, and we showed the court how impossible it is when you don't have access for this service close to the place that you live. And after we filed the petition, we started negotiation with the Ministry of Health, and they presented a very serious program to the court that will end in the end of 2021. They will gonna have 220 new beds, most of them in the north and the south. And there is the first rehabilitation center near Tveria in the north that is now already built, and it will have the first department for rehabilitation for children in the north, first one in Israel. And also there will be a new rehabilitation center for children in Soroka and Beersheba, also for the first time. And the government also will publish standards on how a day center should be. That day center in Tel Aviv and in Kiryat Shmona in the north or Rat in the south will be the same. And it's not going to be the same only by title, but also it's actually the same.
That was 3
This
centers.
is a really great achievement that happened because of this case, but we are continuing this fight with our partners from the north and the south, and we achieve a lot, but we still have a lot to go and to continue this in this trial.
And after the rationale of the pandemic is over, will those stay there? Will they close? You know, all of these questions, there's like, there's so much that we're doing now. Every country's doing now as sort of the situation is harder now, so we have to go out of our way to make things easier in some ways when we win. But then what happens when the rationale is no longer there? Are they gonna take those away? These are, the future is really, really uncertain and important to these questions of socioeconomic equality. But that's a really amazing victory. It's a really amazing victory. Three rehabilitation centers, especially for children and in the periphery outside the center.
And actually, many people that have COVID-19 need rehabilitation when they leave a hospital. So it's also important for that.
Orly, let's look at behind the headlines. Can you point to any big accomplishments or victories this year? What are you really proud of?
So yeah, I think I'm most proud at our victory on the case of racism, of disqualifying racist candidates to the Knesset. Looking back exactly a year ago, the 2 first elections out of the 3 elections that we had this past year, there were candidates of the racist party, Jewish Power, running to the Knesset. This is a party led by followers of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who hold really extreme, horrible racist views according to which all Arabs are terrorists and all of them should be kicked out of the country and not given any rights. We managed due to very, very hard work of collecting a lot of evidence to bring the Supreme Court to disqualify 3 candidates, Ben-Zion Gopshten, Michael Ben-Ari, and Baruch Marzel, because they are racist. And this is the first time the Supreme Court disqualified candidates since 1992, since Meir Kahane was disqualified, because you really need to present very strong evidence to show how extreme and how racist their views are And Gil mentioned how hard they worked recently on the Corona. So I can tell you that this whole time last year was the hardest time I've ever worked so hard since I'm in Iraq. We really worked around the clock for around a month, collecting evidence, and really I think being exposed to such horrible views really feels like poisoning my soul. So it was very, very hard physically and emotionally, but we were very happy that we managed to disqualify them. And actually following this disqualification, we are working toward having them indicted on charges of inciting to racism. So Ben-Zion Gupstein has already been indicted and his trial has just begun 3 months ago. And Michael Ben-Ari, we filed just recently, 2 months ago, we filed a petition against the Attorney General because he did not file charges against him. And actually just today, it was published that Michael Ben-Ari was summoned to the police for interrogation due to our petition. So hopefully he will be indicted soon. So I think this is a major victory because it really sort of sends a very clear message that such a horrible racism has no place in Israeli parliament and is not legitimate. So I think this is very important. And the other issue I wanted to mention, we just recently, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, filed a civil suit for damages on behalf of a woman who was both an Israeli and a British citizen, who flew back when we were able to fly. She took an EasyJet flight from Israel to London, and she was asked to move, to switch seats, to move from her seat because she's a woman, because an ultra-Orthodox passenger was not, did not agree to sit next to a woman. And actually the crew asked her to move and she felt very humiliated. We have a lot of complaints about when we had flights going on, we received a lot of complaints, and we actually did sue El Al 3 years ago, and we won the case, and all then both pay damages to our plaintiff and also said that they will guide all their crew members that such request is illegal and discriminatory and humiliating. But we see it still going on in other places, in other airline companies, and I can say that this is something that is very interests many people abroad. I can tell you that this suit that we just filed just 2 weeks ago made headlines all across the world. I mean, in Britain, but also in the United States and in Poland and in Russia and anywhere. So hopefully this will end with a positive result as well.
And there's a story of some crossover in there. Like I'm sure, you know, it should be obvious to everybody that all of your institutions work together on different issues and things. But our supporters might remember that during when the Kahanists, your first example, when the Kahanists were running for office, we're running for election. They, you know, us are in Canada, we participated in a Zazim action at the same time that you were filing your report that, you know, there was an Israeli petition of Raluca, I believe it was 11,000 signers, Israelis. And then there was another, you know, if you were outside Israel, you could sign a parallel petition in solidarity asking the Central Elections Commission to listen to Iraq's legal petition. And another, you know, I believe it was 10,000 people outside Israel, you know, primarily partners, you know, people who were part of New Israel Fund in the US, in Canada, in the UK, and Australia, all over the world, and other people also. It was a moment of when there's this magical alignment of issues that, you know, happens on the ground. There's an actual concrete something that we can do together, even us here in the diaspora, to help you on the ground. And that we were able to participate and help you both in that way. And I think that was really magical for us to be able to see that we could, you know, our little one click here could actually turn into something much bigger and could help prevent some really, really insane people. The problem is they're not insane, they're perfectly smart.
Definitely, but very dangerous, yeah.
But very dangerous.
Yeah.
I have another question for our panel, for each of our panelists, and then before we get into questions and answers from our audience. So if you haven't started asking questions in the chat or emailing info@nifcan.org, NIFCAN, you know, please go ahead and start percolating your thoughts. But first, we're going to take a 10-minute detour with Linda Hershkovitz, our president again, in order to honor two very special women that are important to this community and are really responsible together for the conversation that we're having today. Linda?
Yes, thank you, Ben. And hello again, everyone. This 10th symposium is a special anniversary for us. It's also 6 years since the passing of the woman whose name is kept alive through it, Shira Herzog. And today we continue to keep her memory alive in a new way with a special award in her honor. But first, who was Shira? Shira Herzog was born in Israel in 1953 to Yaakov and Penina Herzog. She grew up with a profound sense of Jewish history and the miracle of Israel's modern rebirth, which her family was such an integral part of. The Herzog name is interwoven with the tapestry of the state. Her grandfather, Rabbi Dr. Isaac Herzog, came to Palestine in 1937 as the chief rabbi of the Jewish community under the British Mandate. Her uncle, Chaim Herzog, was the country's 6th president. Her mother, Penina, represented Israel at the World Health Organization. Her father, Yaakov, was a senior Israeli diplomat who launched Israel's first secret talks with Jordan and was Israel's ambassador to Canada. And thus Shira spent part of her childhood in this country. Eventually, Shira created her own tapestry. In her case, it included 2 countries, Canada and Israel. She studied at both Hebrew University in Jerusalem and York University in Toronto. She created an eclectic career that combined philanthropy, political analysis, journalism, and community engagement. Shira worked for a decade at the Canada-Israel Committee at the forefront of Israel advocacy, and later headed the private Calgary-based Kahana Foundation, where she spearheaded innovation in community programs in Canada and Israel. As an analyst and journalist, she reshaped public discourse about Israel and Jewish affairs in newspapers, television, and public speaking, as well as her blog. She held leadership roles in research institutes, philanthropic bodies, and academic institutions. Shira characterized her role as one of building a modest bridge and said she had been inspired by her family legacy of learning, diplomacy, and informed dialogue. It led her to sometimes be critical of Israel, but it was, as she said, a loving criticism that she encouraged Canadian Jews to engage in as part of their commitment to the country. Shira passed away on August 24th, 2014, leaving, along with her family, a large and devoted circle of friends and admirers in Canada and in Israel, many of whom are in this audience today. She left an indelible mark on the Canadian Jewish community and the New Israel Fund of Canada, as well as Israel itself, which is why our annual symposium bears her name. I didn't know Shira personally, although I did witness her at work. I once had the honor of attending an event in her home. The subject was feminist activism in Israel. And I remember well her op-eds in the Globe and Mail and the Canadian Jewish News. Her analysis was nuanced and sophisticated, spanning Israeli society and politics, and always with an unapologetic, progressive, and democratic lens. People like Shira Herzog are rare, but thankfully they exist. People who believe in the importance and power of the grassroots, and who personally help build the bridges between Israel and Canada. Shira didn't seek recognition or fame. She used her soapbox to elevate others. And so, with the blessing of Shira's family and many of her friends, it is fitting that this year, in her memory, we at NIFC have created the Shira Herzog Award, which will be given to a Canadian or Israeli who has made an outsized impact on equality and democracy in Israel, either on the ground there or from here at home in Canada. And today, we bestow this new award on a person that Shira knew closely and whose impact on the progressive bridges between Canada and Israel is just as profound, our very own Joan Garson, as she steps down from our board later this year. It's impossible to enumerate all of the things that Joan has done to build progressive Jewish life. Joan is an indefatigable community leader whose service spans decades and a dozen institutions in Canadian Jewish life. Holy Blossom Temple, Arzenu, the International Federation of Reform and Progressive Zionists, the Movement for Progressive Judaism in Israel, CIJA, the Jewish Agency, and of course, the New Israel Fund of Canada. Joan has served on the NIFC board for 11 years and was our president from 2014 to 2017. She has given boundless time and energy. Her strategic thinking and warm friendship are felt in this community from top to bottom. Joan has represented progressive Jewry within Canada and also represented Canada on the international boards of the New Israel Fund and others. She's also a legendary hostess and has generously volunteered her home for countless intellectual gatherings. It was Joan who originally advocated for the need to create this symposium in order to open up the Canadian conversation about Israel to encompass a spectrum of rarely heard voices, representing a range of progressive perspectives on Israeli society, politics, and culture. It's a mark of the respect that she is held in that we have been able to attract such a remarkable list of speakers over the years. It's easy to forget that a decade ago, our community was much more monolithic in its views on Israel. Joan has been instrumental in moving that needle to where it is today. Anyone who meets Joan discovers immediately that she devotes 100% to any endeavor she gets involved in, meaning she's usually operating at least 300% capacity. She sets the bar high for anyone who works with her and inspires us to live up to her example. And so we proudly give to Joan Garson the very first Shira Herzog Award. Now let's hear from Joan, recorded on location in Israel as she accepts this honor.
My friends and fellow supporters of the New Israel Fund of Canada, more than I can say, I am tremendously honored and moved to be the first recipient of this award, named to honor the memory and the impact of my dear friend Shira Herzog. Thank you to the board of the New Israel Fund. The criteria for this award are intimidating. The Shira Herzog Award is given every year or every other year to a Canadian or Israeli who has made an outsized impact on equality and democracy in Israel, either on the ground there or from here at home in Canada. Clearly, Shira would meet this standard. Indeed, it is fitting that in naming this award after her, you, the board of NIFC, have made Shira's contribution defining of the high standard you have set for its recipients, and that NIFC has set for itself. Everyone at this symposium has already heard about Shira. Many of the people watching today were her friends. We all remember her sharply and clearly. The beautiful words which have been said are true, and always they fail to do her justice. We were all her project. As for me, she mentored, guided, and taught me with a very clear idea in mind, how I should impact on the New Israel Fund of Canada and how NIFC should impact on Israel. We, together with Professor Derek Penslar, developed the concept of this symposium. It reflected a particular and shared vision for NIFC, that it should be boldly present in the Canadian Jewish world, intellectually rigorous, addressing topics which had not to that time been explored in Toronto in a large public venue, and working for change. I remember driving to the Toronto Reference Library for the very first symposium, with then co-executive directors of Sikui, Ali Hadar and Ron Gerlitz in the car. We were so thrilled to see a lineup, and at the same time, we had to arrange for security because we were afraid of the response of the Jewish far right to the explosive topics we were discussing: land ownership in Israel, Palestinian Citizens of Israel, with a Palestinian citizen of Israel as a featured speaker. Shira dreamed that NIFC would become a louder and ever more effective voice for a better Israel, and this is becoming true. Thank you, Shira, for pushing me and NIFC to be the best we can be, to take risks, to be brave, because we must. Israel needs us. And thank you to all of you and to all supporters of NIFC for empowering me and NIFC to do the work Shira knew had to be done. And now, NIFC is dreaming of doing even more. The past year in Israel has been tumultuous, and the coming 5 years are going to be critical. That's why this fall, NIFC is launching a 5-year campaign to raise $7 million and triple the amount of work that we do in Israel. And we are also dramatically increasing our coast-to-coast reach and our engagement with young families, synagogues, and people in their 20s and 30s. At her funeral, Shira asked her dear friend Leslie Simpson to read a Naomi Shemer song poem, Al Kol Eleh. For all these, it speaks of the sting and the honey, the bitter and the sweet, the incredible mixture that is Israel. Shira helped me and NIFC to know and to engage creatively, critically with her beloved Israel face on, with optimism. She saw and loved as I do Haaretz HaTovah, the good land, as well as what needed to change within it. In accepting this honor bearing Shira's name, I recommit to our shared attempt to achieve a democratic, pluralistic, and optimistic Israel. As in that song, both literally my daughter, her husband and her family, her baby and the baby to come, the family of the Jewish people, and all citizens of Israel, the little that we have must be protected, and we must do it. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Joan, and please stay safe. Before Shira Herzog passed away, she praised the civil society activists in Canada and Israel, and I quote, who spin the wheels of the quality of life in our communities. This is the mission she inspires us to carry on. So now let's hear more from our three activists, three of the activists whom Shira devoted her life to supporting. Our speakers, Gil, Orly, and Raluca.
Thanks, Linda, and congratulations to Joan. Thanks also to Bob and Jeremy Presner for that lovely video of Shira's life. Gil, Raluca, and Orly, I hope it's also moving for you when you watch this at home, watch it after we're all done, and you see the kind of diaspora Jewish leadership who believe so much in you and who so appreciate you and have devoted a lot of their lives to making both our home communities, conversation about Israel, but also life in Israel better for everyone who lives there. And I know that we're beginning to get questions from our audience, so we'll ask the last question for you before we open up for Q&A. At this point, I think we're really curious. What are you still working on that makes you hopeful? Given the turbulence, given the political instability, given everything that you've talked about so far, what makes you hopeful, or what keeps you determined? And if we can ask, Gil, would you go first this time, Orly, and then Raluca?
Well, fighting for social change makes me hopeful. And especially when we are dealing with social rights, because then you can just see the different parts of the society come together with a rare solidarity and cooperation to make a change for the benefit of everyone. And you can really see that in the social and economic issues that we are dealing with. For example, I'm very hopeful for our big cases coming to the High Court of Justice in December about electricity disconnections. In Israel, in the last year, there were 30,000 families that were disconnected from the electricity because they had debt to the electricity company, and 33,000 other families were connected to prepaid clock that if the money in it ran out, the electricity immediately is disconnected. And we believe that in 2020, people cannot live in dignity in a modern society without electricity. Electricity is something that you need to keep your house cold or warm, or keep your medicine in the fridge. And now, these days, to even fulfill your right to education, because everybody is learning from home. And I'm hopeful because we also had a similar fight to stop water disconnections a few years ago, and it was very successful. And when we brought up this topic to the court, and then because of the petition went to the parliament, to the Knesset understood that this is a critical issue for people, poor family, and the process of disconnecting somebody from water is so difficult and complex that basically the phenomena of disconnecting people from the water supply because they just couldn't afford to pay their debts stopped at all in Israel. Of course, people should still pay their debt, but there are different ways to collect debt and not disconnect them from water or electricity, but in a more humane way, and keep the basic right to human dignity also in these circumstances. What makes me worry on the other side, I was talking about the way I can see a solidarity in Israel in our fight for a social change. But these days, I must say I am worried about the solidarity in Israel when it comes to coming together to fight the pandemic. And we see divided society where each tribe, each group is blaming the other of the unsuccessful way that the country is dealing with the spread of the virus. And for me, as a human rights attorney and activist, so obviously it's a problem. For example, we are fighting for to stop racism and discrimination in housing. But you can have a really good laws and really great decisions in the court, but if people are hostile towards each other and Jews and Arabs don't want to live together, or secular and religious don't want to live together, nothing will work. I mean, this is something that we need to change, and it's definitely a challenge in Israel these days, specifically how we can go and start being more one fabric and one society, and not just, different tribes living in the same territory and fighting each other.
So what makes you hopeful is that when you do your work, it works. And
when there is a fight, there is hope, right? So, I believe that things can change for the better, and I do believe in this Israeli society, and I think that we also see changes that are very promising, also in the ultra-Orthodox community and also in the Arab minority, and so I'm very hopeful. But obviously, I also sometimes feel worried about things that I see in my society. But I don't want to depress everybody, so it will be better soon.
Orly, where do you get hope? What keeps
Well,
you?
I'm actually going to start with the despair and finish with the hope. To end with an optimistic note. So,
Oh, you see, that's what I should have done.
I think that in general, social change work and human rights work is very frustrating. It's a Sisyphean work, very, very long work. And sometimes we have victories and then sort of there is a setback. There is a lot of uncertainty, especially because of the political situation. And I can give you an example. We have struggled for many, many years to get funding from the state for our rabbis. After many, many years that the state has funded only Orthodox men employed by the state. We've had one breakthrough 7 years ago, but rabbis working in our congregations in cities were not funded by the state until 2018. And after 3 long petitions, we finally made the change. And in 2019, it was the first time that the state has started to fund the salaries of our rabbis. But then came 2020 and no budget was approved and COVID-19 and there is no money. And the state just told us a couple of months ago in June that actually there is not going to be funding this year. Why? Well, last year we had money, now, we don't care, that's fine. Now, of course, all the Orthodox rabbis continue to get their salary. So we decided to take this to court, and we actually had a hearing exactly a week ago. I must say I was pessimistic, but the court was very disturbed also by the fact that discrimination was reinstated and ordered the state to explain why they're doing so. So that was sort of, in a sense, it was frustrating, but then it was surprising because now we have to make sure that there is money. But still, it was just shows you the uncertainty. So even when we have a winning or we have a weak victory, it could turn the upside down later. But I think what makes me hopeful is that we've made a lot of progress on different issues, especially when we're looking on the Israeli public opinion. So when I look at issues such as women's rights or LGBT rights, we've made an amazing progress in the past decade. I can tell you that when I filed the petition against gender segregation on buses, people in Israel could not understand why it's wrong. Of course, people in the United States, in Canada were horrified, but Israelis were like, oh, leave it, that's fine. And nowadays, people understand that this is illegal and that they should fight it. And the same goes for LGBT rights. I can tell you that a couple of years ago, we filed a petition about the fact that only straight heterosexual couples were allowed to adopt a baby in Israel. So LGBT couples were not allowed to adopt a baby. We filed a petition, and at first the state answered, the court filed an answer saying that, this is the law because LGBTQ families are different and would not allow a baby to have a normal life. This was the first response, and this created a lot of public outcry, and many people went to the streets. We had a lot of demonstrations, and just a week later, the state filed a different response saying, well, we reconsidered our position, and now we say, the law is not okay, we're going to change it. And you saw the strength of public opinion. So I think the fact that the public is with us on many, many issues is really we've made a lot of progress looking back. And other things that make me hopeful is the solidarity between organizations here in Israel. I've been working with Tazim, with ACRI, with many organizations supported by NIF and NIFC. And in general, the support we get from the public, both here in Israel and abroad, people like you really gives us energy to continue to fight, our fight to make Israel a better, more pluralistic and more just society.
And Raluca?
I'll follow Orly's example and start with what makes me worried. And that is the complete lack of accountability we see from our political representatives. A functioning democracy depends on a few elements. One of them is a strong and active civil society, and I'm proud of Zazim's part in nurturing and strengthening the Israeli civil society. And the other one is some level of accountability. That means that there is a public space in which civil pressure and public pressure has a meaning and can have impact. And without accountability, there is no trust between the public and the authorities. And when that trust breaks down, so does the social contract that holds our society together. And it's not news that Netanyahu has zero accountability in everything that he does, and he has no responsibility towards the public interest. But this year, with Gantz's decision to take millions of votes against Netanyahu and join the unity government, was a serious blow to the public trust in democracy and in its formal basic procedures, including elections and voting. Because what does our vote mean if the elected representative are doing the opposite than what the majority wanted? So is the government's arbitrary decision-making regarding the pandemic. Just now, an hour ago, the government has decided on a second lockdown starting Friday, when there is no organized strategy or decision-making. It's just a classic divide and rule tactic, and that caves into different pressure groups without any logical or just proper procedures. And restoring accountability and building a new social contract is what we have to focus on in the next year and a half. The thing that makes me hopeful is exactly that vibrant civil society that hasn't lost hope and is our biggest hope at the moment. I'm proud of our part in mobilizing regular citizens, not professional activists. And I'm proud of the 201,000 Azim members that have been more active than ever in the last 6 months. Those of them who are protesting in Jerusalem or across the country, those who launch their own campaigns on local issues in our distributed campaigning platform. Those who don't have time or possibility to attend demonstrations, but can take the time and add their name to an online call, and by that making it stronger. Our model is very inclusive in that regard, and it allows everyone to be part of what we do, no matter what resources you have or don't have. And our model is also based on the actions of our members. So the feedback and the reward is super quick. So seeing the numbers go up inspires me and gives me hope. It means that our work is relevant, needed, and meaningful.
All of your work is what gives us inspiration to keep, to keep our faith in Israel's well-being and its future alive. Now it's time for questions and answers from our audience. So we've already received a number of questions, and I don't want to keep us too much long after time. But for those who want to stay to hear their answers, I think we're gonna give our panelists just one round of closing questions for the moment. We wanted to ask, how is the political instability affecting your work? All three of you. And then we also have so think about that for a second. The second question is sort of what's the future for your work? Like what's next? What's on your agenda to work on? And then I think the other question that we have time for, because you have to be quick with your answers. And I'll leave you to respond to all of these at once. We'll go in order. The third question is sort of, what can be done to support you from here? Like, how do people follow your work? So if you got those three, it was, how's the political instability affecting your work? What's next? And how can we follow you or participate with you? So if we can go in that same order, if we can go Gil, Raluca, and then Orly, and then we'll end it. And it's getting late there, so we'll let you all go to bed.
Well, the political instability is definitely a factor in our work. I'm sure everybody knows that Israel is in an ongoing political crisis for more than a year. We had 3 elections in 1 year. And for many, many months, we had to take a government that was not elected, but ruled because of the principle of continuity. And so in this sense, at least now we are having some relatively normal situation where we have a government that is ruling, and there's no election now in the near future. But in Israel, you can never know. And we are trying to work regularly and not letting this come in our way. But obviously, it's raised a lot of problems and different issues that we have to comment on or respond to. You asked about the new things that we are working on. One of the new projects that I'm heading in ACRI is it's called the Human Rights in the Digital Age. And when we are trying to understand many of the new dilemmas of human rights that are part of the digital age where information is very easy to collect and to know a lot of things about us, and new technologies entering without public discourse, without regulations that can be a bless, but also on the other side can be very harmful for human rights. And these days we are planning to file a new petition in next week to the court about the decision of the police and the army not to reveal anything about the use they do in facial recognition technologies. Although we do know that they use this technology, especially in the West Bank on Palestinians, but also in East Jerusalem and maybe in other parts of Israel. And so we are working on transparency in this area, and many other new dilemmas that are very interesting for our organization that we never dealt with, that are related to the digital age. And the last question was, how can you be in touch with us? So we have a very vivid Facebook page in English, and our website is also have an English department, and we are trying to put as much of our work also in this part translated to English, and everybody can just follow us also in Twitter and Instagram. And we really appreciate the support that you give us. It's giving us the ability to keep doing what we are doing. And also the support of Israelis. This week, we just finished a campaign to raise money in Israel from small donors from regular Israelis. And it was very successful. We raised almost 850,000 shekel in 1 week from just small donors in Israel. And about 35% of our budget is from Israelis. So we think it's the combination of support from just regular Israelis and all of our supporters abroad is very important, and we appreciate it. And thank you for that.
Thank you, Gil, and Mazal Tov.
Thank you.
Raluca?
Yes. So the first question was about the political instability. So there are a couple of layers to that questions, and I'll be short, but on a personal note, for me and for my team, the last almost 2 years were a roller coaster. There was no stop. since they declared the early elections in December 2018 till now. It was we just kept going and worked harder than ever before. And I just came back from maternity leave in November, just right into that. And it's been really almost 2 years that were completely exhausting. For Zazim in general, and for our members, it also was a great opportunity to do big and bold things that we haven't done before, like our initiative to provide transportation for the Bedouin citizens from the unrecognized villages to get to the polls and to fight voter suppression. And our work really became more known, more branded, more impactful in the spirit. And of course that it's worrying to be in such a state of political instability, but there's no way walking around that. And I know that sometimes it feels easier to have just stable government and to face what you already know and are familiar with. But the government needs to change, and it will happen sooner or later. And it's just life. If you want our democracy to survive, we'll have another election, probably in March, and maybe another one after that. But at the end, it will all be good. So that's about that. And the second question was on, remind me, please.
What's next for you? I think you sort of already said it.
I said it. It depends on what's going to happen, and it's going to be a different kind of year if the pandemic will be under control, and it's going to be a different kind of year if we're going to have elections in March. But whatever happens, we'll just keep fighting for democracy, for equality, and to end the occupation, which is something that we haven't mentioned enough in this call, but it's the core issue of our work.
And follow you, or how do
you can do more than follow us. You can be part of what we do. Most of our members are Israelis, but we do have a small but very important group of non-Israeli members from the States, some from Canada. So you can enter our website and join our list, and we offer our non-Israeli members around one action a month, depending on our capacity, basically. But I can assure you that everything that is really important gets to you. So I really invite you to join us.
Thanks, Raluca. Orly, you get the last word.
Okay, so the political instability, I think, influences some of our cases. Our two big religion and state issues are the Kotel, the Western Wall, asking for an egalitarian place at the Western Wall, and the conversion case. Both cases, the state every couple of months ask for extensions and for postponing hearings because of the political instability, and because they say, we'll wait for a new government and then we'll bring the whole issue to the government again, and then it never ends, and it just takes forever. So that's frustrating. On the other side, the fact that now we have a justice minister who is not against the law, the legal system, but rather supports it, is tremendously helpful. And we are a little more, I think, a little less stressed out about different initiatives, radical initiatives that will not go through because the justice minister will block them. So I think that's good news when we think about last year. We're working now on many new cases. We have new suits we're going to file on behalf of women. For instance, a woman who is not allowed to board a bus because the driver decided there is only a room for men and not women. There are still cases like that. We have a racism crisis center that we have opened 3 years ago, and we received different complaints. So we have a case of a Bedouin person who has been over and over, is going through profiling. He was basically racially treated because of his race. So he was always asked to be identified, and he was also one time beaten just because he's Bedouin. So this is another case we're considering. And also we're helping many of our congregations, Reform congregations across the country, to receive land allocation and budgets to build synagogues, because municipalities allocate lands and budgets to many Orthodox congregations. But for our congregations, it's always a long legal struggle. So we have a few pending, and we have a few more coming up. And how you can be in touch with us and support us. We have a weekly newsletter called The Pluralist, which is distributed to tens of thousands of people all around the world. So I invite you to join. You can just Google The Pluralist IRAC and you can sign up. Each week, basically, we tell about a different case that we're dealing with the same week. So I think it's really interesting and could keep you posted. And of course, our Facebook page. And I think really being involved in what we do is really, really important. And of course, I thank you so much for supporting us and for allowing us to continue to do our work.
Thank you to the three of you. You know that your work is crucial, and you know that we support you. But we'll say it again anyway. Your work is crucial because it gives us hope that change is not just possible, but that it's happening. It's already happening. You guys are having victories at the grassroots, and some that rise even to the level of newspaper headlines, and that we see that, and that we are here in solidarity with you, and that we support you. I hope you've also learned a little bit about Shira Herzog and Joan Garson, the sort of kinds of activists here in Canada who really lead us in our solidarity with you and how much we owe them. So thank you to the three of you. Go get some shut-eye. To our friends and to those of you in Canada, thank you for joining us today and thank you for your support. As Joan said, the next 5 years are going to be critical for Israel. And we have a plan to defend and advance equality and democracy in Israel. We want you to be part of it. And our partners in Israel are going to need, as you've seen, all the help we can raise. We raise all of the funds that we devote to these amazing activists from individuals here in Canada. We also need your help in Canada to educate others about the situation in Israel. I'll take a moment to talk about one new program that we've launched, is a special social justice in Israel curriculum for teens and preteens. And you may have noticed in your confirmation email a short guide for parents and for bubbies on how to start the conversation about Israel and social justice with your kids and grandkids. In the coming months, I'll ask you to consider making a generous commitment to this work and to the work of our Israeli partners over the next 5 years as we help people like Gil and Raluca and Orly defend human rights during a turbulent time, and of course, the recovery that will follow. As we've already seen this year, nothing less than equality and democracy are on the line. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for your support. Bye, and have a